God, Country, Notre Dame. Not just a lofty motto etched in stone at the Basilica, a Notre Dame tradition of military service that runs deep. From Father Corby's chaplain duties in the Civil War, to the Navy taking over the campus in World War II for officers' training, many sons and daughters of Notre Dame have and continue to serve around the globe.
I can remember some of the boys didn't make it. I can remember thinking, I'm pretty lucky to be alive.
A Veterans Day tribute to Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Everett Blakely, the former head of Air Force ROTC at Notre Dame from 1960 to 65. A B-17 pilot in World War II, he and his crew had less than a 50% chance of escaping death, injury, or capture. Immortalized in the book A Wing and a Prayer, written by his navigator, Harry Crosby, they will be profiled in the upcoming Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg's Masters of the Air series, epitomizing the courage and sacrifice from the greatest generation's veterans.
And I'm here with my father, Everett E. Blakely, doing an interview for future generations.
His son, Dr. James Blakely, class of '69.
This is my great-granddad's airplane with his crew.
And his family have been on a mission of their own to preserve this Notre Dame legacy of service. I'm correspondent and former Marine Captain Mike Cerre, class of '69, for another edition of God, Country, Notre Dame. Dr. Jim Blakely, my fellow classmate, class of '69, thanks for joining us from Dallas, Texas this morning.
Glad to be here.
You know, your late father, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Blakely, who this story is about, and your entire family for that matter, really were Notre Dame classes of 1960 to 65. Tell me about your father's involvement with Notre Dame.
Well, Dad was transferred to South Bend, Indiana to be the head of Notre Dame Air Force ROTC in 1960. And then he left in 65 when I just before me starting Notre Dame.
Now, you're now a doctor, but at one point you wanted to be a pilot like your father and joined ROTC at Notre Dame.
Yes, he set a good example. I wanted to also be a pilot, so I joined the Air Force ROTC for the first 2 years. But then I found out they wouldn't let me be a pilot because I wore glasses.
Let's go back to 1940 when your father signed up into the Army Air Corps. Now, that was a time when most Americans were isolationists and didn't want to get involved in another war. And people weren't signing up for the military. Why did your father sign up?
Well, he was an avid reader of the newspaper and listened to the radio news. And he saw that Hitler was a real bad guy in Germany and that he invaded Poland and he occupied Czechoslovakia and essentially overtook Austria. And at that point, he said, well, I think America's going to get in a war with the Nazis. And so a recruiter came around recruiting for pilots, and he decided, yeah, I want to be a pilot, and he signed up.
At the time, I believe he was at the University of Washington, so he had to drop out of school to go into flight training.
That's correct. He dropped out of school and before Pearl Harbor and started his flight training in California.
Now, he was initially going to be a fighter pilot, and then they changed and they needed some other types of pilots very desperately for the European theater. So they switched him to becoming a bomber pilot. Tell me about that.
Yes, he went in. All the people that signed up for pilot training wanted to be in the small, nimble, fast fighter planes. The Air Force decided for them that they would be bomber crews and not fighter pilots. So he actually took a lot of training in various fighters and went into one of the bases, and his orders were changed and he was going into B-17 training.
So after initially training as a fighter pilot, he gets transferred to flying bombers, B-17s, and gets sent to Europe with the 100th Bomb Group. They were one of the first groups over there to take part in the European campaign, I believe.
They were one of the first, yes, that's right. Not the very first, but they were there early in the war when the losses were so bad.
Well, they quickly earned the moniker the Bloody Hundredth, and it was a very dubious distinction, but it really did signify how dangerous that assignment was.
Yes, they got the name of the Bloody Hundredth because they had a lot of losses, a disproportionate number of losses, because they went on the most dangerous missions early in the war.
I think the loss ratio for all those bomber pilots was nearly half of them were killed, injured, or captured. So it was not only his squadron, but all bomber pilots flying in the European theater really had a very short life expectancy.
Well, yes, that's true.
And nevertheless, he kept flying his missions. I think most people remember the TV series and the movie 12 O'Clock High. In the movie, Gregory Peck does a pre-flight briefing to the squadron and says, "Don't worry about it, you guys are already dead." Is that pretty much how they had to deal with that risk?
I think they thought their chances of survival were not that great because so many of their brethren in the 100th Bomb Group got shot down. For example, my dad's barracks held 16 officers to 4 different crews. And then on October 10th, there were 3 of them left. The others were missing in action. And one was in the hospital. So, yeah, and then besides that, Dad and the rest of the 3 guys had to fly like 8 more missions.
Wow.
So you can see how that would be pretty scary.
Jim, to make sure that your family and actually others recognize the sacrifices your father made and the service he did, you took it upon yourself to interview him before he died, to get his in his own words how he felt about this. And in his own words, he said the risks were quite great.
The requirement during my period was 25 missions, and you had served your tour and would come home. In order to make that, your odds were that you were shot down 2.5 times to make your 20 missions. So you beat the odds 2.5 times, which is pretty good. In other words, one gets shot down every 10 missions is what it added up to.
So even 2.5 times if you're shot down, not a big deal. He had to kind of shrug it off.
It's easy to say that now.
1943, bombing mission of a German fighter factory in Germany. It was a very difficult mission.
Yes, it was the Regensburg mission. The Messerschmitt plant was in Regensburg, and it was one of the longest missions to date, and it was heavily defended by flak and German fighters. And there were tremendous losses during that mission. But fortunately, they did knock out the Messerschmitt fighter factory, and it took months before it came back. And as a bonus, they destroyed some of the new equipment going into making the Nazi jets that came out later in the war, and it delayed production of those jets, which were particularly devastating if they had come out earlier.
Well, that story about that 1943 raid was chronicled in several books written about the bomber groups. In fact, one of the more famous ones, A Wing and a Prayer, by Harry Crosby, who was very close and personal with your father.
Well, yes, Harry Crosby was Dad's navigator, and he wrote a book called A Wing and a Prayer, published in '93, which is the best book about the 100th Bomb Group. The stories in it are fabulous.
Well, only a few months after that very difficult raid on the German fighter factory, then they had to take on the submarine pens up in Bremen, another very dangerous mission. And let's hear in your father's own words how that went.
And again, we were leading, and just as the bombs were dropped, we got hit by flak and lost an engine and fallen out at formation, and we had a running fight all the way home with the fighters that were up to finish you off, you know. I feel real fortunate. The guys I had on the guns did the job, and they got them before they got us. But I mentioned a while ago about looking out the window, you know, and down at the ground and seeing flak come up. And it's an odd experience. We had lost a second engine in the process. We did get some of the fighters hit us with 20 millimeters, and lost another engine. I had two of the waist gunners. Both of them had been hit. One's died a few days later at the hospital when we got back. And the radio operator had flak. The ball turret had been hit. So I had about half the crew that was injured. Fortunately, I didn't get anything.
His plane was riddled with over 800 bullet holes by the time it got back and crash landed in the UK. And he had told the crew chief that the seat he was sitting in was uncomfortable. And it was uncomfortable because there was an armor plate in the bottom of the seat. And so he asked the crew chief to take it out. Well, when he got back, the crew chief had not taken it out, and they removed the armor plating and found two big dents on the undersurface of the plating. And after that, he claimed that the armor saved his ass.
You know, talking about all the hits the plane was taking, he lost two engines. He had to do an emergency dive to try to put out a fire in another engine. All these things that he's having to do. Trying to bring that plane back, as crippled as it was an extraordinary feat.
It was an incredible event, October 8th, 43. They went out and before the bomb run, they got a flak hit that took out an engine that was burning. And then later on the flight, they had another engine that was out, and they were limping back to the UK out of the protection of the formations. And the Luftwaffe attacked them time after time after time. And the gunners were very accurate that day in Dad's B-17, and they shot down or got credit for downing 9 Luftwaffe fighters, which is probably a record to today. It was quite a harrowing mission. Bullets riddled the airplane, and the salvage crew documented, as I said, over 800 holes in the plane. And they made it back. Their landing gear, the tail landing gear didn't go down, and when they landed at an auxiliary field, one of the two landing gear, main landing gears collapsed. They lost control of the plane and hit a major tree just a couple of feet from my dad. And it was well documented, and we have multiple photos that I hope that you can show.
Yes, and you went back yourself to try to see where that tree was and where the landing site was. Did you actually get to the landing site?
Yes, the UK museum, there's a museum there which I encourage people to take. It's in a town called Thorpe Abbotts, England. And there are volunteers manning this museum for the past 20 years or so. And they told me they thought the tree was still up, and they started a quest to find the tree and told me they had the tree. And so I said, well, I got to come and see that tree. And I wanted to see the whole site at Ludham, England. So my wife and I traveled and had a wonderful visit with the local people. By the way, the English people in that part of the UK, which is called East Anglia, love us. They love Americans, and they'll let you know. So I encourage everybody to take a visit to that part of England. There were over 40 American bases there. And it is such a nice area with very few tourists, with the English that care for us, that want our presence, and they are excellent allies.
Jim, I understood you took it upon yourself to also visit the graves of some of the men that your father flew with.
Yes. Lester Saunders, the waist gunner, is buried in the Cambridge American Cemetery in that part of England. I visited him. And then Bubbles Payne, the navigator, is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery in Normandy.
I think many more people will be aware of your father and his colleagues' stories with the new television program Masters of the Air, which is coming out on Apple TV in January.
When we get this job done,
it's okay.
Yes, he's one of the characters in the TV series Masters of the Air, which will be streamed by Apple. This is a series that is produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. And when Steven Spielberg gets involved in a series, let me tell you, it's something the whole United States and the whole world will know about eventually. And there are 200 characters. There are 5 main characters. Everett is kind of a medium character. People will know his name. And the others, I want to stress that while Everett is my personal hero, there were so many heroes in this band of brothers, in these crew members. It's inspiring to me.
What's also inspiring is the fact that your family has taken upon themselves to be so much involved in maintaining the history of Lieutenant Colonel Everett Blakely, and including your granddaughter, who did a little video about his service.
This is my great-granddad's airplane with his crew. And up here you can say 13 bombs because they have went on 13 missions. And this is my great-grandpa's. He was the pilot.
Given your interviews with your father and your granddaughter's videos about his experiences, it's pretty safe to say, I assume, that the Veterans Day is a very important day for the Blakely family.
It sure is. I mean, not a day in my life doesn't go by when I think about veterans. And I have the example of my dad to use as a veteran, and the family honors the veterans. I have 2 grandchildren that are named Everett in honor of Everett Blakely, and 1 grandchild named Ernest in honor of Ernest Blakely, because that was his middle name.
Dr. Jim Blakely, class of '69, thank you for sharing this very personal story about your family's service to help us get a little more personal context on Veterans Day and God Country Notre Dame.
Well, I am so glad you did it. Thank you. And I hope to see you in the future.
Thank you, Jim.